Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Connect HR Hangouts. It's your favorite sizzling host, Babi Mawela. We are so excited to have you here. And if you are new here, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for your loyalty. Please don't forget to comment, share, like, and, click on the notification button so that every time we upload a new episode, you receive a notification. Enough with the long intro. In studio today, I've got the amazing Khethiwe. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, and you, Babi.
Thank
you for having me.
Thank you for coming through. By the way, I shot my shot here, and I feel very honored that you accepted my invite with no hesitation. So I want everyone to know who Khethiwe is, why are you here, your journey, your professional journey, and if you'd like to share your personal journey as well, you're more than welcome to.
Certainly. So who is Khethiwe? So Khethiwe is, before anything, the eldest of three girls. Okay. So I've got two younger sisters, and I'm a mom to a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old boy. So my daughter's 16 and my son is 13. And originally from Soweto, so grew up in Soweto and moved to Spruitview when I was 9.
Okay.
And schooled in the south of Johannesburg and right up to matric, and went to Pretoria for tertiary, So I studied, my first undergrad is actually finance, credit management, which was an interesting story because my dad was of the opinion that you should study something that's more people related. Yeah. You've got such good interpersonal skills. Like, no, Daddy. I went on to do credit management, completed it, and started on a grad program at Mercedes-Benz South Africa. So the grad program worked on a rotation base. So my first rotation was in finance, and after about a month, I knew that this was definitely not for me.
Yeah.
So I rotated into the chief operating officer's area. And within that space, he asked me, what are you passionate about? I'm like, I thought I'm passionate about finance, but I've just realized that this is not what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that the things that I really did enjoy in tertiary was volunteering and giving back. At the time, corporate social responsibility wasn't a big thing.
Yes.
So he then gave me a project, Chalk Childhood Cancer Foundation. And within 3 months, had a fundraising gala dinner with Chalk Childhood Cancer Foundation and raised over R250,000 rand.
Sure.
And that is how I say my calling and my passion found me, So I am a corporate social responsibility practitioner, with over 20 years experience, and really progressed through the years.
Yeah.
Worked for Mercedes-Benz, worked for myself for a short while, about 3 years, and then worked for Momentum for about 5 years. And I integrated the corporate social responsibility program of the merged entity of Momentum and Metropolitan.
Yes.
And once I'd successfully integrated that program, I was headhunted by Accenture. That was in 2014. So I spent literally 11 years with Accenture.
Nice.
And the work that I did at Accenture was really around empowering unemployed young people.
Yes.
So in the almost 11 years that I was there, we empowered over 92,000 young people. And the work that we did around there is really around leveraging technology as an accelerator to job creation.
Okay.
So really addressing the skills gap. And I did that for South Africa, then a region called the Middle East, Africa, Russia, and Turkey. And then about, I'd say 8 years ago, my portfolio grew to expand to include transformation as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that is the journey that I've traveled, so truly passionate around creating environments where people can really bring their authentic selves every single day.
Yes.
That is the crux of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is.
Yes.
So if we look at diversity, it's really around the difference, right? The difference in terms of ethnicity, gender, people with disabilities, pride, and the likes. The inclusion for me is how people feel. in terms of making sure that they are included, they can contribute. And equity is providing the adequate support for individuals and meeting Baballo in her unique perspective to enable her to succeed within the organization. And the culmination of that is then belonging. When people feel that they belong, they then build careers within an organization. So that is what really lights me up every single day. It's what drives me. It's the two, in terms of youth unemployment from a community point of view, really driving quality programs to enable young people. I often say that talent is dispersed equally, but opportunities aren't. How do we unlock dormant talent in young people in our townships? I also always say that young people are not going to continue to sit quietly in the street corners.
No.
How do we make them productive? How do we meet them where they are and give them a hand up for them to actually access livelihoods? So together then with just humanizing the workplace. I'm very passionate about creating safe spaces, where people, regardless of their ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, mental health, broad, in terms of the DEI agenda, can show up every single day without cutting parts of themselves out.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. You're actually my third guest who's touching on DEI. And I was so excited because I love to hear the different perspectives about DEI, right? And thank you for also explaining what it means to you. And your face literally lit up the moment you started touching on the topic. And I want to hear from you, in your observations and in your experience, what are the misconceptions around the topic of DEI?
Yeah, I think it's a timely conversation, right, in terms of globally what's happening in terms of the global pushback. I think some of the misconception which I want to address relating to especially the global pushback from the US, the misconception that DEI is compromising on quality, and qualification. If anything, that is a complete misrepresentation of what DEI is. Because what DEI really is about is to say, regardless of where someone comes from, let us be intentional about diversifying the people around the room and sourcing from different talent pools so that we can enable people, that are qualified regardless of their location for them to access opportunities, So the two for me are not mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean that because you are driving the agenda of DEI that you're compromising on quality. If anything, it's actually what we know for sure is minority groups. If you look at, for example, a young black female and someone from a rural community, can you imagine the hoops that they've had to jump to actually get to be at the seat at the table? The resilience. There's an example I like to make of a young man that I was exposed through a scholarship that I was running. So this young man actually went through the scholarship. He came from Limpopo, first generation grad, and studied at UCT. So he's moved provinces at the age of 18. And can you imagine the resilience in this individual? Started from scratch and completed cum laude.
Sure.
And when he came in apply for the grad program, he was declined by the business. And the reason that was cited when I requested the documentation was that he was too timid. So my response is then to say, too timid based on what? We are talking about potential here. We're talking about intellect. This young man has proven that he has the intellect. And because he sounds differently, and because he's not polished, he's not confident, because of the background that he comes from, you're then discrediting and disqualifying him. Needless to say that I really did manage to advocate for this young man, and he did join as a graduate trainee and really flourished within the organization. Because if we are basing it on some of the terms that would be used is, for example, the person is not a culture fit. So what does culture fit mean if you double click on that? Are we wanting to create more of the same, where we only want people that sound a certain way, that come from certain schools, that you then actually create more of the same, you know, but there's a room and there's place for everyone.
Yeah.
Even that young man from that rural community, if we are not including him, can you imagine how we're losing out in terms of the resilience and the grit and the perspective that that young man can actually bring in terms of serving customers that are from that community?
Yeah.
You know, so it really just, for me, highlights the importance of really just thinking very differently about it.
Yeah.
You know, and saying there's value in, you know, difference. And I often say that there's no disservice to diversity, equity, and inclusion. If anything, it is to the organization's advantage, because the more diverse we are, the better we are to serve our clients.
100%.
The levels of innovation increase, you know, because we avoid groupthink. Everyone thinking the same way,
100%.
everyone that looks the same, sounds the same, you know, comes from the same background, you know, comes from private schools, comes from top-tier universities, you know, that just perpetuates the repeated cycle of more of the same.
True. Sure, that is amazing. And so what I'd like to share actually is that what attracted me on LinkedIn is this passion. You know, I just saw this very young, beautiful lady who was sharing important information on such an important platform, which some people don't have access to, right? And I wanted to touch on your journey, leaving Accenture and, you know, starting a new organization, which I am extremely proud of, SkillQuest. That is, tell us more about that.
So, as I mentioned, and I think I'll touch on in terms of the journey, right?
Yes.
If I talk about those 92,000 young people that we impacted in my 10 years at Accenture, those are 92,000 families that would have not otherwise benefited. And these are young people, typically the type of people that we used to cater for are, you know, and it's a term I don't like, which is youth that are not in employment, education, or training. I prefer the term that is used in the US. So in the US, they call them opportunity youth. So it's seeing them in terms of the potential and the positive rather than everything that they are not.
Love that.
You know, so because of the varied, you know, geographies that we did this work, we had a model in Gauteng, we had a model in the Western Cape, and we had a rural model where in rural KZN, our work was more around livelihoods.
Yes.
You know, but what I saw, what was the common thread amongst all these young people, if you put love, time, and passion into opening up their minds, young people show up. You open up their worlds. And I love the term as well that was coined by the Rockefeller Foundation in terms of impact sourcing, you know, because you find young people that are within the demographic of impact sourcing, because these are young people that often are neglected. What you then find is, one, just in terms of their loyalty, in terms of completion of programs and commitment to programs. And once they're employed as well, in terms of their loyalty and how they are not going to be the ones resigning, you know, because they're so grateful that they were given this opportunity. And I think the point again that I raised earlier on around talent being dispersed equally.
Yes.
Whether it's Jozini Ndumo, an off-grid community, or Soweto, or Vosloorus, you know, or Langa, we have seen that in the breadth of the country, there are young people that have potential. And I think for me, one of my bugbears is really around the quality of programs that are available. You know, so that was the main motivator for me to say, I've seen that if you put the heart into it and put quality into these programs, they do yield results where you don't see young people hopping from one learnership to another.
Yes.
Where you see young people continuously just being seen to have perpetual potential, you know. But if you really do not just purely chase the BEE points, but you chase in the true spirit of the legislation, substance over form.
Yes.
You see the value, you know, so that is what has been the driver for me in terms of starting SkillQuest. So SkillQuest, we offer, you know, skills development programs in partnership with Tuto. So We
Shout
also, in there as well, is really just our alignment was really around the quality and the innovation, right? And democratizing access to quality education and quality learning programs for young people. And making sure that we remove barriers in terms of the access. And the second part is around my passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I offer consulting services. I am ISO accredited. So there's a new standard around DEI, which is a global standard. And the standard is really a guide in terms of best practice, in terms of implementation of DEI. And I think it also dispels where often people restrict DEI to only HR and the HR elements.
100%.
But DEI is much broader than that, right? Because in the standard, we unpack in terms of how diverse are your products that you are actually selling as an organization. How diverse is your supply chain? You know, so it's much broader, and the extended impact as well in terms of the communities. You know, so I'm one of 1,000 people globally that are ISO accredited. So really wanting to make sure that we are also really professionalizing the industry in terms of DEI. You know, in South Africa, I think it's a fairly new industry. You know, so really professionalizing it. So working together with organizations that, or people that wrote to the standard to promote the standard locally and promote this passion of mine around building organizations that, you know, rehumanizing organizations. And of course, I also do, having 20 years experience in transformation advisory, as well as corporate social responsibility advisory. You know, so the main driver for this is also me wanting to expand this beyond just one organization, but I see the potential of this, not just in South Africa, by the way. I've got African ambitions where I want to do work on the continent, because I really feel that the work that we are doing in terms of accelerating and advancing, you know, opportunities for young people really need to be scaled and accelerated into Africa.
Sure. Congratulations on your new journey. I think this is amazing work, and you know, I feel so proud and honored in this moment to be hearing about this and the impact, which is the message that we love to share as Connect HR. And I think that's what ultimately connected us, the impact that we're trying to drive. So I feel very honored to be sharing a space with you at this moment. So organizations are having a challenge with implementing DEI initiatives. And I want to understand, what are the practical steps that organizations can, you know, take to implement DEI practices?
Yeah, I think the starting point is the intention, you know, so being intentional about it. And moving beyond the tick box and really seeing it as an opportunity. I think there is a clear business case to it. And the starting point could be even saying we want to set gender goals, to say by X year we want to have 50% representation of our total workforce being women. You know, and you then build programs that speak to addressing that. That could be in the form of, you know, leadership development programs, acceleration of women, coaching, mentoring, you know, that's just women. If we talk about people with disabilities as well, it's the start in terms of the intention, right? To say we want to have X number of people with disabilities within our organization because we see value, right, in terms of the 1 billion people globally that have a disability. So it's also an untapped market if you're not prioritizing disability inclusion, you know, and again, you then build programs that speak to the development and the attraction of those underrepresented groups, you know, and holding yourselves accountable, right? Holding what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, and holding leaders accountable in terms of making sure that if it's programs or the goals are for 5 years, we have year-on-year targets that we then put in place. And I think for me, it mirrors back to, for example, you know, my passion around the fact that I really do believe that the reason that we've not made the relevant progress locally around things like BEE and employment equity is because we've only focused just around the diversity and not tap into the equity, the inclusion, and ultimately belonging.
Yes.
You know, because if we tap into those elements, it then will result in the long-term sustainability. Attrition is reduced, for example. So if we look at, for example, the current Employment Equity Amendment Act, that is what companies should be prioritizing. Beyond having the EE plan, you know, and it's beautifully explained in our local, you know, terms, in terms of the fact that we address the barriers, the affirmative action measures. Those are the equity and the inclusion part. Let's bring it to life, you know, and really embrace the spirit of this beautiful legislation, you know, and not just follow a tick box approach. I make an example and say that I think since the inception of the EE Act, you know, there's been very little progress in terms of the top layers of corporate South Africa. You know, and that's why the department is then saying, we've got the data. You've been reporting in terms of your employment equity. We know what the sectors look like. We're going to use this data to then stretch the target slightly and give you 5 years to achieve those targets. If you're not going to achieve those targets year on year, targets that you've put in place, you're not going to get a certificate of compliance. If you don't have a certificate of compliance, you can't do business with government. You know, so it's really then putting in place a stick approach, you know, because of the lack of progress, you know. But I really want to implore corporate South Africa to move beyond compliance and truly embrace, you know, the spirit of equity. Even employment equity, the equity part is what has been missing, you know.
So that's amazing. And I shared a story with you about my son earlier on, and you touched on two very important factors of DEI, which I feel they fall under DEI, neurodivergency. Is it neurodiversity?
Thank you. Neurodivergence.
Yes, divergence. Let's please educate my people on neurodivergence, because you write a lot of articles about that, and I feel that some people fear that eventually they won't fit in workspaces because of the stigma around neurodivergence. So please share your thoughts on that.
So I think for me, if we look at neurodivergent and people that are, you know, would be considered, you know, as people that aren't neurodivergent, for me, more than anything, it's a different way of thinking. That's how we should see it, right? And there's real beauty in the different way of thinking. Some of the top strengths of people that are actually on the spectrum is, for example, just a different way of thinking, levels of innovation, because they have a different perspective of thinking. There is as well the high moral ground. You know, they are highly ethical people. And I think at this moment in time, as I was sharing with you earlier on, we actually do need people that are actually neurodivergent if we look at the challenges that we're facing just globally, right? You know, so within organizations, if organizations aren't tapping into neurodiverse people, that is in the likes of autism, in the likes of dyslexia, there's so many broad elements of this. How we should see it is an untapped potential of people that are really highly intelligent. You know, there's, we were speaking earlier on about a certain South African who is actually in the US. So if it wasn't for Elon Musk, there wouldn't be SpaceX, who is neurodivergent, you know. So it's an indication in terms of just the intellect and the smartness, you know. So it's really for people to, one, I think with any topic that is usually related, that has stigma attached to it, it's because of lack of education. So the starting point is just education. Educate and then educate others. You know, create a platform where we openly engage in dialogue and address the stigma. You know, I think it's also layering what we're talking about also from a culture point of view. You know, there's just so many complexities, but there's just so much support as well available to make sure that neurodivergent, you know, people do actually grow and they flourish, organizations are intentionally targeting, neurodivergent individuals. If you look at some of the organizations like Topco, who measures, Top Employer,
Yeah.
who does the survey and publishes every year. Things like neurodivergency for the last 2 years are some of the things where they'll ask, do you have a neurodiversity program?
Yes.
And how does the program look like? And often it would be grouped under disability, but it's actually not a disability.
Yeah.
It's just a different way of thinking, so there's a lot of research that is available just around the spectrum itself. And more than anything, it's an untapped opportunity in terms of just talent that is highly intelligent, very different in terms of thinking, very innovative. And as I mentioned, I think the high moral ground.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Khethiwe. I think let's take a short break and we will be back. Thank you for staying tuned. We are about to wrap up the episode. But before I do, Khethiwe, I always like to leave our guests or our audience rather with some motivation. And I want to know from you, what do you want people to remember you for? And what mark do you want to leave in this world?
It's as if you know the soundtrack of my life. So the soundtrack of my life is I Was Here.
Yeah.
Which is Beyonce's song. And I think for me, what motivates me is that in terms of just leaving the world better than I found it, making a difference. If I can change just one person's life, I would have succeeded, and the 92,000 people that I spoke about at Accenture that I actually impacted, those are young people, who from time to time I would bump into people where I'm at a speaking engagement and someone says, you changed my life.
Yeah.
You gave me an opportunity when no one believed in me. So I also want to be known for creating safe spaces and humanizing the workplace. I think it's a movement around really creating psychological safety. I think I'm very passionate around psychological safety, where if, for example, topics like mental health and topics that have a lot of stigma, you have contributed to educating people around, mental illnesses, educated people around disability, educating people around neurodiversity, educating people around pride and sexual orientation, and environments where people, because of education, and the progress that we then make through this education, we create spaces where people don't feel that I must cut parts of myself out. I must leave my blackness at home, and be sound in a certain way. I must leave my disability and I don't want to disclose because I'm afraid that it's going to limit my progression, whether it's visible or non-visible. I want to be known as well for addressing some of the issues relating to people with disabilities, where people would want to almost nitpick and say, we want this type of disability. But educating people to say, everyone belongs, and everyone has got value to add, and let's not compartmentalize people. Let's see people as human. That is the humanizing. Let's go back to the groundings of Ubuntu, where I see the human in you, regardless of our difference. We see the humanity in us. That's what I want to be known for.
Amazing. And where do people find you on social media?
So I'm on LinkedIn as Khethiwe Nkuna, and my business page is SkillQuest.Africa. And then I'm on Instagram as Khethi Nzima, and on Facebook as Khethiwe Mazibuko.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies and gents. You have the comment section at your, convenience. Please leave your comments. Let us know what you think about the episode. We'll be excited to hear from you. Signing out from this amazing episode It's your sizzling host, Babi Mawela. See you next time.